Why are old African leaders scared of Gen Z? Are African leaders afraid of their youth? According to PLO Lumumba, the old guard clings tightly to power, unwilling to pass the baton to the younger generation. They fear that if the youth take control, they will revolutionize Africa. But who is standing in the way of this transformation? Let's find out. Why do African youth, despite their numerical dominance and boundless potential, find themselves waiting endlessly to lead? In his revolutionary address to Generation Z, Professor PLO Lumumba exposes the political games, economic dependencies, and intellectual vacuums that hinder Africa's progress. His message is simple: Africa's youth must stop waiting for permission to lead. Through political rhetoric, the older generation continues to cling to power, but the real issue lies in economic control, where foreign corporations still dominate.
It is the duty of every young man to be angry with the society. Today we live in a country where there is need for anger.
For years, African leaders have used the phrase "leaders of tomorrow" as a form of placation, assuring the youth that their time will come, just not yet. Professor PLO Lumumba begins his speech by addressing the tragedy of this narrative. Generation after generation of young Africans has been promised a future in leadership, but when that future arrives, it is often a mirror of the past. The same aging politicians clinging to power, leaving little room for new voices.
And you are still told you are leaders of tomorrow. That is part of the problem of the continent of Africa.
The phrase "leaders of tomorrow" has become a political strategy designed to deflect pressure from young people demanding change. As Lumumba points out, many African countries are governed by leaders who are decades older than the majority of the population. In countries like Uganda, with President Yoweri Museveni, and Cameroon, with President Paul Biya, we see leaders who have been in power for decades, some nearing their 90s, while the youth are marginalized from meaningful political participation. According to the United Nations, over 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25. Yet the political systems do not reflect this demographic reality. This is not just a delay tactic. It's a structural barrier designed to prevent the youth from claiming the political power they deserve. The idea that the youth must wait for their time ignores the fact that leadership is about capability, not age. It perpetuates a paternalistic system where the youth are infantilized and expected to follow the rules set by those who have already failed to deliver progress. Generation Z, Lumumba argues, must reject this narrative entirely. The future belongs to those who seize it, not those who wait for permission to lead. Lumumba's call to Gen Z is to recognize that the idea of waiting is inherently disempowering. African youth must stop asking for permission to lead and instead take proactive steps to influence politics, business, and social change. This can be seen in grassroots movements like the Now End SARS protests in Nigeria, where young people organize to demand police reform, or the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, where students challenge colonial legacies in education. These movements exemplify how Gen Z can break free from the myth of leaders of tomorrow and claim their role in shaping the continent today. But taking leadership doesn't necessarily mean occupying political office. Leadership can manifest in community organizing, business innovation, and even cultural production. The youth must redefine what it means to lead by focusing on creating change in every sphere of life, not just in government. For Gen Z, the lesson is clear. The future isn't something they will inherit. It's something they must build. But as the youth rise to leadership, they must grapple with a harsh reality. Political titles in Africa often don't come with real power. So, what does power truly mean in the African context?
A friend of mine was telling me he's from South Africa, he's a white South African. He told me, what we did in many African countries is that we gave you Africans the crown without the jewel. And we gave you a toy called politics. That is what you play with. You love to be called presidents, you love to be called ministers with motorcades, but we control the economy.
Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. PLO Lumumba takes a scathing look at the nature of political power in Africa, arguing that while African leaders may enjoy grand titles, president, prime minister, and minister of finance, these titles are often meaningless because they don't come with true economic control. Lumumba's critique cuts to the heart of a critical issue. Political independence without economic sovereignty is a hollow victory. Africa's political independence was largely formal, with the transfer of power from colonial administrations to African leaders. However, the economic systems and structures that were put in place by the colonial powers remained largely intact. These systems were designed to benefit external interests, not the African nations themselves. For instance, African countries continued to export raw materials while importing finished goods, a trade pattern established during the colonial era. The World Bank's reports acknowledge that African nations remain dependent on Western and Chinese markets for economic growth, locking them into cycles of debt and dependency. Lumumba calls this the crown without the jewels. African leaders may have been given control over their national parliaments, but the real power, control of resources, industries, and economic policies, remains in foreign hands. This is evident in the way multinational corporations dominate Africa's most lucrative sectors, from oil in Nigeria to rare minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo. According to the Natural Resource Governance Institute, only a small fraction of the wealth generated from Africa's resources stays on the continent, with the majority flowing to foreign corporations and investors. For Generation Z, the takeaway is clear. Political office in Africa often functions as a ceremonial role, with true influence being exercised by multinational corporations and external financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank. These organizations often dictate the terms of economic policy through loan agreements that come with harsh conditions, including austerity measures and privatization of state-owned enterprises. For instance, in Zambia, a country rich in copper, IMF-imposed austerity measures have led to cuts in social services, while the profits from the copper mines are siphoned off by foreign corporations. Lumumba's message to Gen Z is that if they want to lead, they cannot be content with merely occupying political office. They must understand that real power lies in controlling the economy. This means taking charge of Africa's resources, industries, and markets. It means building African-owned companies that can compete globally and retain wealth within the continent. Lumumba points to examples like Dangote Group, owned by Nigerian billionaire Aliko Dangote, as a model of African economic power. However, for every Dangote, there are hundreds of foreign-owned companies extracting Africa's wealth without reinvesting in its people. The fight for economic sovereignty will require more than just political rhetoric. It will require structural reforms and innovative thinking. African youth must push for policies that support local businesses, invest in infrastructure, and develop industries that can process raw materials on the continent rather than export them. This also means tackling corruption, which has long been a barrier to economic progress. Transparency. International's Corruption Perception Index ranks many African countries among the most corrupt in the world, a reality that allows foreign companies to strike exploitative deals with local elites. For Generation Z, Lumumba's message is simple but profound. Don't be fooled by political titles. The real power lies in economic control, and without it, the youth will simply be playing a role in a system that continues to enrich others at the expense of Africa's future. As the youth push for economic control, they will need more than just ambition. They will need knowledge. But how equipped are African youth to lead with wisdom and insight? PLO Lumumba's speech takes a critical turn when he addresses the intellectual disconnection of African youth from their own history and knowledge systems. He argues that one of the most significant barriers to effective leadership is a lack of understanding of Africa's intellectual heritage. The youth, Lumumba laments, are often more familiar with Western political theories and historical narratives than with African governance systems or philosophical thought. This intellectual gap, he warns, makes it difficult for African youth to challenge the status quo or imagine alternative futures for their continent. Lumumba's critique resonates with a broader problem in Africa's education system. According to UNESCO, Africa's education curricula remain heavily Eurocentric, focusing on European history, literature, and political thought, while African systems of governance, philosophy, and history are often neglected. This is not just an issue of representation, it is an issue of power. People who do not know their history are easier to manipulate, and this intellectual dependence on the West reinforces Africa's subjugation in the global order. For Generation Z, this disconnect presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that without knowledge of their history and culture, African youth are at a disadvantage when it comes to leading effectively. They are more likely to adopt foreign models of development, governance, and economics without questioning whether these models are appropriate for Africa's unique context. For instance, many African nations have adopted Western-style democracies without fully understanding the indigenous governance systems that existed long before colonialism. The Gada system of the Oromo people in Ethiopia, for example, is one of the oldest democratic systems in the world, yet it is rarely taught in African schools. Lumumba urges the youth to reclaim their intellectual heritage by engaging with African thinkers and systems of governance. He mentions figures like John Henry Clark, a Pan-Africanist historian, and the Oromo Gada system as examples of intellectual traditions that can inspire new ways of thinking about leadership in Africa.
Then, of course, as people do in social media platforms, you say, I have read. I said, name for me in the next 1 minute, don't Google. In the next 1 minute, name for me the book by John Henry Clark that you have read. Of course, he had not read.
Lumumba also highlights the importance of reading, emphasizing that knowledge is the foundation of any successful revolution. Without a deep understanding of Africa's history, culture, and political systems, the youth cannot hope to lead the continent into a prosperous future. For Gen Z, the solution lies in reclaiming intellectual sovereignty. This means not only studying African history and philosophy, but also creating new knowledge that reflects the realities and aspirations of modern African societies. Lumumba calls on the youth to engage with global knowledge systems, but to do so from a position of intellectual strength, not dependency. The internet provides an unprecedented opportunity for African youth to access information from around the world, but this access must be used to build a new intellectual foundation for Africa's future. Lumumba's message is clear: knowledge is power, and without it, the youth will continue to be pawns in a global system that does not serve Africa's interests. Gen Z must become intellectual warriors, reclaiming their history, engaging with their culture, and creating new knowledge that can guide Africa into the future. But even with knowledge, Gen Z faces a significant obstacle: the older generation's refusal to step aside. What can Generation Z do about it? One of the most entrenched problems in African politics is the unwillingness of the older generation to relinquish power. Lumumba describes this as the old bananas refusing to die, a metaphor for leaders who cling to power far beyond their prime. This isn't just a matter of age, it's a matter of control. The older generation, having benefited from years of political dominance, is reluctant to step aside because doing so would mean losing access to the wealth and influence that come with power. For Generation Z, this creates a significant challenge. The older generation's grip on power leaves little room for young leaders to emerge. In countries like Zimbabwe, where former President Robert Mugabe ruled for nearly 4 decades, or Uganda, where President Yoweri Museveni has been in power since 1986, the youth are often left on the sidelines, watching as their future is determined by leaders who are out of touch with the realities facing young people today. According to a report by the African Union, the average age of African leaders is 63, while the median age of the population is just 19. Lumumba argues that this generational power struggle is not unique to Africa. It is played out in various forms throughout history. In Europe, the French Revolution saw the overthrow of the aristocracy by young revolutionaries. In China, the Communist Revolution was driven by youthful energy and radical ideas. Even in the United States, the civil rights movement was led by young activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis. The lesson is clear. Young people have always been the driving force behind social and political change, but they must be willing to challenge the status quo and demand their place in leadership. But how can Generation Z navigate this power struggle without creating chaos or instability? Lumumba offers a nuanced approach. He acknowledges that the older generation has valuable experience and wisdom, but he emphasizes that this should not be used as an excuse to hoard power. Instead, Lumumba calls for intergenerational dialogue, where the older generation mentors the youth while gradually stepping aside to allow new leadership to emerge. Mentorship, however, is a two-way street. Lumumba warns that young people must not simply accept the guidance of the older generation without question. They must challenge outdated ideas and push for innovative solutions to Africa's problems. This means engaging in constructive dialogue, where the youth learn from the past while pushing for new approaches to governance, economics, and social development. For Generation Z, this is a call to action. The youth must not wait for the older generation to step aside voluntarily. They must create their own spaces for leadership. This can be done through grassroots movements, entrepreneurship, or by running for political office. The key is to build alternative structures of power that are not dependent on the approval of the old guard. Lumumba's message is that the power struggle between the old and the young is inevitable, but it doesn't have to be destructive. With the right balance of mentorship and innovation, Generation Z can take the reins of leadership while respecting the contributions of the older generation. But even if the youth successfully navigate this power struggle, they face a final and perhaps most critical challenge: achieving economic independence. What concrete steps can African youth take to break free from economic dependence and build a sustainable future? Lumumba's speech culminates in a powerful call for economic independence. While political power is important, Lumumba argues that it is ultimately meaningless without control over the economy. Africa's political independence was not matched by economic sovereignty, leaving the continent dependent on foreign aid, investment, and technology. This dependence has stunted Africa's development and perpetuated cycles of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. For Generation Z, the challenge is to break these cycles by reclaiming control over Africa's economy. This means not only building businesses and industries that are owned and operated by Africans, but also creating economic systems that serve the needs of the continent rather than external interests. Lumumba points to China's rise as a global economic power as an example of what can be achieved when a nation takes control of its economic destiny. In the span of a few decades, China transformed itself from an impoverished nation into the world's second-largest economy by prioritizing domestic industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Africa, Lumumba argues, has the potential to do the same. The continent is rich in natural resources, from oil and gas to rare minerals, yet much of this wealth is extracted by foreign corporations. According to a report by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development UNCTAD, Africa loses over $50 billion annually in illicit financial flows, much of it due to tax evasion by multinational companies. This is money that could be invested in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, but instead, it is siphoned off to offshore accounts. For Generation Z, the path to economic independence starts with entrepreneurship. The youth must become job creators, not job seekers. They must build businesses that can compete globally, create jobs for their communities, and reinvest profits back into the continent. But entrepreneurship alone is not enough. The youth must also push for structural reforms that make it easier for businesses to thrive. This includes advocating for better access to finance, reducing bureaucratic red tape, and fighting corruption. Lumumba's message to Generation Z is that economic independence will not be handed to Africa on a silver platter. It must be fought for. The youth must be willing to challenge the existing economic order and create new systems that prioritize African interests. This is not just about economic growth. It's about economic justice. Africa's resources should benefit its people, not foreign corporations or elites. In the end, PLO Lumumba's address to Generation Z is a call to revolution, but not a revolution of violence or chaos. It is a revolution of ideas, of knowledge, and of economic power. He challenges African youth to stop waiting for their turn to lead and to take control of their future now. The task ahead is daunting, but with the right balance of ambition, knowledge, and action, Generation Z can build a new Africa, one that is politically independent, economically sovereign, and intellectually empowered. The question is, are they ready to rise to the challenge? Will African youth want to take charge? Let us know in the comment section. If they don't, do they have any other way to find a better future for Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.